Hello, and welcome to today's webinar on developing a reading schedule. I'm Betsy Malarsic, and I'm a learning skills specialist with the Academic Resource Center. Today, we're going to be talking about ways to make recurring reading blocks for homeworks that have a lot of reading so that you aren't constantly being surprised by all the readings that you need to do for each of your classes. Feel free to add any questions or comments to the chat throughout this session. There are typically two types of students who find that they are helped by a reading schedule, and it's based on how much time they spend on their course readings. The one type of student is someone who spends way too much time on readings. This is the student where they find that readings are taking over their life and they're struggling to balance readings with other responsibilities. So having structured blocks can help this person make sure that they're limiting how much time they're pouring into their course readings. The other type of student is someone who doesn't spend enough time on course readings. Sometimes these students struggle to get past the first page, or something else always is more important, so they tend to put these readings off indefinitely. So these are the two kinds of approaches to reading that we're going to try to combat by going through a few steps. So the 5 steps that we're going to be going through for developing a reading schedule. First is to figure out how much time should be spent reading outside of class. Next is to weigh your real reading time against your ideal reading time. Third is to schedule your reading blocks. Fourth is to set up reminders for those reading blocks. And fifth is to assess and adjust reading blocks. So we're going to go through this process step by step. Let's start with step 1, which is figuring out how much time should be spent reading outside of class. Numbers that you may have seen before are the general calculation that for each course credit, you should be doing 2 to 3 hours of work outside of that class per week. This is a slightly higher number for STEM courses. Many STEM courses may require 3 to 4 hours per credit. That means that for a 15 credit class, professors are expecting you to spend about 30 to 60 hours doing work per week. And on this chart here, you can see that going to class is about 8% of the overall week. And then we have 3 sections that indicate time spent on work outside of class. The minimum time here is that 2 hours per week. Add on top of that the additional study time, that additional 8% to hit the 3 hours per week. And then for the STEM courses, add that final 8% on top of all of that. So you can see that there's a big range here for doing work. So these are very much guidelines. 30 to 60, that's almost potentially double the minimum to hit the maximum. So you want to find your balance within that. If you're way under, though, maybe consider how you can approach doing work more purposefully. And if you're way over, think about how you can scale back. It's important to mention as well that not all of this time is spent on readings. You have other homework tasks and major assignments, worksheets, blog posts, problem sets, essays and test prep presentations. So the amount of time spent specifically reading is going to vary based on other tasks. I would recommend starting with calculating how much time you're spending on other tasks, and then based on that, fill in the rest of those time blocks with your reading times. And if you know you have essays and papers coming up in the future, calculate that in your overall weekly assessment. You might not be spending 60 weeks in coursework right now, but maybe you will be during finals time. Once you have determined how much time you should be spending on readings outside of class, weigh your real reading time against your ideal reading time. A good way to do this is to look back over the past week and assess how many hours you spent working on readings. And ask yourself, how far off are your current reading habits from where you want them to be? In determining a reading schedule, we can't simply look at the numbers we were just talking about, how many hours you should be reading per week. We also need to look at how many hours you are actually reading per week. And the goal is to try to find a bridge between those two extremes. In order to develop a healthy reading habit, you should aim to increase or decrease your reading time slightly first and work your way up to bigger changes. So if you currently read 0 hours a week, maybe try reading 1 hour per class a week. And if you're currently reading 5 hours per class a week, maybe aim to cut back to 4 hours per week. So for a habit, when you're trying to develop a new system or a new habit, you want to try to make small changes first and become comfortable with those. And once you're comfortable with those new routines, you can build upon those. But if you try to go from one extreme to another, that's not realistic. If you figure out that you should be reading 15 hours a week and you try to do that immediately from reading 0 hours a week, that's such a big change that I can already predict that you're going to have difficulty maintaining that. It's better to try to start small and then build on that. And once you become comfortable with those systems, you can continue adding more reading hours on. So once you've figured out how many hours you want to schedule, the next step is to actually schedule these reading blocks. And that's the key to developing a reading schedule, is that we're actually creating real events and planning on them so that you know specifically when you're going to start working on readings and when you're going to end working on those readings. So to begin planning these blocks, you want to start by asking these questions. When should I read? And I have here some important sub-questions to consider when looking at your week and trying to determine what are the best times each day and which days each week you should really focus on reading. Consider, what times of day do you have trouble focusing? Sometimes we can tell that a plan is set up to fail just based on past behavior. If you have lots of difficulty focusing on readings on Friday afternoon, and you've tried and failed in the past to read on a Friday afternoon, then I can predict if you schedule a reading block for that time, it will not go well. Try to avoid those times when you know that you aren't going to achieve the task. Ask yourself, how long can you stay focused on a reading? Another big reason that reading schedules often don't succeed is because students may try to complete an entire reading in one sitting and schedule one massive 7-hour block of time where they are going to complete all of their readings for one class for the week. A secret with time management is that the longer you set aside to work on a task, the longer you have to procrastinate. So while you may have time to complete all of the readings in that time, it's also easy to procrastinate for 5 or 6 of those hours and then only work on readings for 1 or 2. So it makes more sense to schedule 7 hours, 7 separate times, if you know you're going to have trouble staying focused. The next question to consider: what format are your readings in, and when will you have those materials with you? You need to make sure that you are well prepared for these reading blocks. in that if you need to read on a computer, you're in a space where you can do that and have internet access and be in a setting where you can focus. Or alternately, if you have a physical book, making sure that you have those materials with you if you're planning on not returning to your room before a reading block. And related to that, consider which spaces on campus are most conducive to reading. If you regularly try to read in your room before bed, then maybe that's not a great time or place to try to do reading. Maybe instead try to go to lounger and set aside a time just for reading. You can take a lot of pressure off of yourself when you need to do a reading if you visualize the reading block beforehand. If you know which reading you're doing, where you will do it, and what you need to have in order to complete the reading, and you can prepare all of that beforehand, then when it actually comes time to complete the reading, it will be more automatic. You've taken a lot of the hard decision-making work out of the scenario, and now you can focus on completing the task. When developing any new habit, a good concept to consider is habit stacking. This is when you incorporate a new habit by scheduling it after an already existing habit or routine. I think the key example of this is most people hopefully, are brushing their teeth early in the morning. So if you have a habit that you want to incorporate, something small in the morning, maybe making a cup of tea, can you cue yourself to do that right after brushing your teeth? For me, a good morning habit is drinking coffee. I do it every morning. So if I want to incorporate something in the morning, I can stack it on top of my coffee drinking, and that automatically cues that it's time to do the new habit. So having a habit that you're already working through or a routine and then adding a reading atop of that can make it a lot easier to automatically move into reading. It's worth considering, first of all, what daily routines do you have that could act as a natural precursor to scheduling a reading block? A good example of this would be going to class. If you have a class and then you have a period of time, how can you make it automatic that when you finish that class, you then move into the reading? Also, consider what other obligations do you have for this course that may put you in the mental mindset to approach readings. If you have an econ problem set due and it's due at a reasonable hour, does it make sense once you've turned it in to then sit down and do econ readings because you're still in that mindset? So here's potentially what this could look like. For theology class, if I have that in the morning and I have time right after, perhaps I could schedule my theology reading block for immediately after. I'm already out in the world and I'm already thinking about theology. So I have both the mental and the external motivation to continue working on theology coursework. And then we also have this example of the econ problem set due. Once you've turned it in, can you keep the econ work going by moving right into your readings? When you are creating your reading blocks, here are a few things to keep in mind. One is that you should have specific goals for each reading block. Aim to complete a specific reading or a section of a reading per block. So with the last page that we looked at with these calendar blocks, I have my specific subject, theology and econ. You could make this even more specific by naming the reading or naming which pages of the reading you want to work on. If you have trouble focusing, break your readings into sections and schedule several smaller blocks instead of one large block. We already talked about this a little bit with how you can procrastinate for longer when you have a longer block. So why not break it up into smaller blocks? Something that's important for everyone with their reading schedule is to commit to your end time. If you want to read beyond it, challenge yourself to stop. And if you want to finish early, don't let yourself. This is a tip that's especially important for folks who spend too much time on reading. If you can challenge yourself to stop when you've planned on stopping, that can help you figure out how to read more efficiently and focus on what's more important in a reading. Alternately, if you are mentally finished well before you're completed the reading and you're forcing yourself to read to the end, note that when creating your next reading block list for the following week and make your reading block shorter. It's better to have a short and productive reading block than a long, unproductive reading block. It's also important to avoid perfectionism with readings. Trying to read everything perfectly often prevents us from reading anything at all. And this is something I see happen both with students who read too much and with students who don't read anything at all. There's a pressure to read everything with such devotion, which is a sign of being a good student, that it becomes impossible to complete in a timely manner. So here's an example of what breaking up a reading could look like. With a theology reading, I've scheduled here my theology classes in the morning. Then I have a 2-hour block. So I've just planned on reading 10 pages of theology for 1 hour and then having a breakfast break for an hour. Then I have another class at 11. And after that class, I'm going to finish my theology reading, which is another 15 pages. So I'm using this whole morning to work on completing this one assignment, but I've broken it up and paced it amongst my own break time, which is breakfast, as well as other courses. So this is much more manageable for me as a reader. I'm more likely to sit down, achieve a manageable goal like 10 pages in a reasonable time, like an hour, than I am to read 25 pages in 2.5 hours. Once you have scheduled your reading blocks, the next step is to set up reminders. Consider what systems do you use to remind yourself of different tasks and events. Daily planners, Google Calendar events, phone reminders, and productivity apps are all great tools for this. I often recommend treating a reading block like an event. It's a time that will appear on your calendar when you shouldn't be scheduled to do anything else. And if something else comes up and the reading block is a conflict, instead of canceling it, you can move it. So having it in the same space that you have other events can help you maintain the system. Consider also what routines can you use to plan out your reading blocks. What routines are established when you're thinking about assignments for the next week, and how can you use those times to proactively schedule specific reading blocks? So ask yourself, do you have a certain time during the week when you're looking over your assignments? This might be a Sunday evening period. If so, if you're looking over all of your readings for a course, use that time to also schedule out the readings. Say, well, I know I have this reading and that reading, so when am I going to work on them? Perhaps your professor reviews your upcoming readings and assignments at the end of class. Use the momentum of that, and right after class, just go into your Google Calendar and edit your reading block event to add the reading. Or just flip through it, see how long the reading is and where it naturally breaks up, and consider how you could address that as reading blocks. And again, working on other assignments for the same course can be a good cue to just think about planning. Planning out the reading blocks is a good way to remind yourself that you want to continue with these reading blocks. And it's also a less stressful step to begin those readings. It can be a good bridge to developing a healthy habit. That brings us to step 5, which is to assess your reading blocks and to adjust them. After you've tried your reading schedule for a week, 2 weeks, consider which reading blocks were most productive and which were least productive. The goal here is you want to learn which habits are best for you based on how you responded to certain reading blocks in the past. So reschedule your unproductive blocks based on which systems work best for you. If you found that breaking up readings doesn't work, try making them longer. If you found longer reading blocks don't work, try breaking them up. Perhaps there's one day a week when you regularly aren't reading. Where else could you move that reading block? And then after you've had 1 or 2 successful weeks, you could add more reading time or cut down on your reading time, depending on what your goals are. With any plan, you want to be constantly reassessing and constantly updating based on your course needs and based on your goals. We mainly talked about organization today for determining a reading schedule, but I did want to mention that we have other webinars online posted on the ARC's YouTube page. And one of those that we did in the fall is focused around breaking down complex readings. So if you want to get some tips on how to approach a reading and break it down into smaller steps, or to pick out the main idea of a reading, I would recommend taking a look at that. I also wanted to mention that our next webinar is Getting Organized for Midterms on Wednesday, February 15th at 4 p.m. It's going to be another time management scheduling type webinar where we're going to focus on how to balance homework alongside the influx of tests and papers. So it's kind of a good next step to this topic we were talking about today. And you can find information about both the next webinar and our past webinars at the webinar webpage, which is listed at the bottom here. If you have any questions, feel free to add them to the chat. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining me today, and good luck developing your reading schedules.